Welcome to this custom deep dive. We are so glad to have you with us today. Our mission for this conversation is to unpack the invisible forces that basically built the very cities we all live in.
Yeah, and we're working through an incredibly dense and honestly a really fascinating stack of notes on the geographic and economic foundations of urbanization.
Right, right. And before we really get into it, right where you are listening to this, I want you to consider a seemingly simple question. Why is your specific city located exactly where it is?
It's a great question to start with.
I mean, if you look out at the skyline or just, the sprawling infrastructure of your neighborhood, you might occasionally wonder why this massive concentration of humans and buildings formed right here rather than, say, 50 miles down the road.
Exactly, because the reality is that the concrete environment we navigate every single day is not random at all.
No, not at all.
It's the end result of highly specific geographic and economic formulas playing out over centuries.
And I think we often navigate our daily lives treating the layout of our metropolitan areas as if they were, I don't know, like naturally occurring phenomena, like mountains or rivers.
Yeah, like they just sprouted out of the ground. But every transit line, every commercial district, every sprawling residential suburb is a testament to centuries, sometimes millennia, of calculated human decision-making reacting to geographic realities.
So the source material we are examining today establishes a crucial historical baseline for all of this.
Right. And when we talk about urbanization, we all generally understand it as the concentration of populations in dense urban cores, right?
Yeah.
Offset by suburbanization, which is the movement pushing individuals and businesses outward.
Out to the edges, yeah.
But what the notes highlight is the sheer scale of this timeline. The foundation of this urbanization process has been grinding forward for roughly 10,000 years.
10,000 years. That's just wild to think about.
It really is, and it set the stage for the dramatic, unprecedented acceleration that kicked off globally in the mid-18th century.
That context completely reframes how we should view our daily routines, I think. As we explore the mechanics of this, I want you to picture your own regular commute.
Oh, that's a good way to visualize it.
Right. Think about the direction you travel when you head to your office or when you're just navigating to the store. Are you moving inward, drawn by the gravity of the dense core? Or are you moving outward toward the edges?
Because you are physically participating in the ongoing push and pull of urbanization and suburbanization every time you get in your car or hop on a train.
Okay, let's unpack this. The notes assert that the spatial distribution and initial growth of any city are determined by two fundamental geographic concepts, and those are site and situation.
Two very distinct things, even though they sound similar.
Let's start with site, which is the absolute location. This refers to the actual physical, geographical, and topographical characteristics of the land on which a city is built.
The literal dirt you're standing on.
Exactly. We're looking at access to fresh water, the fertility of the soil, the structural viability of the land for building, can it support heavy structures, the climate, and historically, how defensible the terrain was from invasion.
And the historical context provided in the research illustrates why site was the initial catalyst for all urban development. The world's earliest cities emerged within agricultural hearths.
Which were basically perfect little pockets of geography.
Right. There were specific geographical pockets where the physical site factors were so remarkably favorable that nomadic populations could finally transition to stationary living.
They didn't have to keep moving to survive.
Exactly. The sheer abundance of fresh water and optimal soil meant the land could sustain a concentrated permanent population. That physical topography provided the initial spark for human settlement.
But looking at modern engineering, I have to wonder if site is becoming a bit irrelevant. And we can build massive, sprawling megacities in the middle of the desert now, or we can reclaim land straight from the ocean.
We definitely can.
So doesn't the initial topographical advantage ultimately take a back seat to a city's broader connectivity these days?
What's fascinating here is how the source material addresses that exact dynamic. While modern engineering absolutely allows us to overcome certain physical limitations today, the topographical advantages of site historically provided the essential early momentum. It dictated the early resource costs.
Which you needed to even get the city off the ground.
Right. And it wasn't just about agricultural viability either. Sudden resource availability, combined with a strong physical site, frequently triggered massive urban booms. The notes actually highlight San Francisco as a prime example of this interplay.
Oh, right, with the harbor.
Yes. The settlement initially possessed a highly strategic physical site factor in its natural deep-water sea harbor. But the absolute explosion of rapid development in the 19th century required an economic shock.
The 1849 gold rush.
Precisely. The sudden availability and extraction of that gold, combined with the physical site's capacity to handle massive influxes of maritime arrivals through that deep water harbor, transformed what was just a strategic settlement into a major urban power.
But your earlier point about connectivity leads directly into the second geographical concept, which is situation.
Right, so if site is about the absolute topographical characteristics, situation is entirely about relative location.
Where it sits in relation to everything else.
Exactly. It describes a city's network centrality, its connectivity to broader regional or global networks. A city's situational advantage often dictates its primary function, determining whether it operates primarily as an administrative center, a manufacturing hub, or a massive node for global trade.
So we are essentially looking at topographical advantages versus network centrality. If a city is situated along high-traffic trade arteries or positioned really close to other major economic nodes, its growth trajectory accelerates dramatically.
It's all about what you're connected to. And the sources detail three distinct examples of how this situational advantage dictates both function and economic prosperity. Proximity to major trade arteries is arguably the most significant predictor of a city's long-term influence.
The nodes point to Hong Kong in China to illustrate this,
They
right?
do. Its primary situational advantage is its position at one end of the Grand Canal. Because of that highly specific relative location, its functional outcome was rapid population density and wealth accumulation. It operated as a vital, high-volume trading artery for the whole region.
And the geography shifts completely when you look at the next example, Samarkand in Uzbekistan. But the underlying mechanic of network centrality remains identical.
Totally identical.
Samarkand was situated at a highly strategic midpoint on the Silk Road. Because of its relative location on that specific overland route, it amassed incredible power and wealth, acting as a major land-based trade hub, facilitating the flow of goods between distinct empires.
And returning to maritime networks, we have the third example, which is Shanghai, China. Positioned as a heavily trafficked maritime port, its situational connectivity allowed it to capitalize on long-distance ocean trade.
So in all of these historical models, the initial topographical dirt mattered, sure,
Right, you need a place to stand.
but their eventual evolution into massive metropolitan areas was dictated entirely by what their situation allowed them to connect to.
Exactly.
So, taking a moment to analyze your closest major city right now, consider its historical foundation. Was its early success dictated primarily by its physical site? Perhaps it's situated on a navigable river system or a defensible peninsula? Or was its expansion driven by its situational connectivity to broader global markets?
It really changes how you read a map once you start looking for those things.
It does. But physical foundations and historical trade routes only explain the origins. The research emphasizes that cities are highly dynamic. Once established, their ongoing expansion and their physical footprint are driven by 5 evolving factors.
And the first two of these primary factors are driven entirely by technological leaps. These leaps fundamentally altered how humans interact with space. The first factor is transportation technology. Historically, the mechanisms we use to physically move dictated the geographic boundaries of our urban environments.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources trace a clear spatial evolution based directly on transit capabilities. In the era of the quote-unquote walking city, urban footprints were incredibly dense and geographically constrained.
Because you could only go so far.
Exactly. The boundary of the city was dictated by the physical limitations of the human body. An individual could only live as far from the economic center as they were willing and able to walk on a daily basis.
And that physical constraint maintained high urban density for centuries. Everything had to be packed in tight. The disruption arrived with the advent of mass transit, specifically the streetcar.
Oh, the streetcar totally changed the game.
It did. The introduction of fixed rail transit systems allowed the city's footprint to stretch outward along those exact rail lines. Populations could commute greater distances efficiently, which initiated the earliest forms of meaningful outward expansion.
It often resulted in those star-shaped urban boundaries, right? Following the tracks outward.
Precisely. But then the 20th century introduced the ultimate spatial disruptor,
The automobile.
the automobile, coupled with expansive highway systems. This combination acted as the primary catalyst for the widespread suburbanization we defined earlier. The personal automobile decoupled the worker from fixed transit lines entirely.
You could just drive wherever there was a road.
Right. And government-funded highway infrastructure drastically reduced the time cost of long-distance travel. The result was a massive decentralized outward push, allowing populations to reside in peripheral settlements entirely separated from their city center employment.
Which brings us to the second technological driver, communication advancements. The nodes frame modern cities as nodal entities.
Nodal entities, yes.
A node relies entirely on the rapid exchange of information and capital. When you introduce technologies that accelerate communication, you significantly reduce friction for businesses. This increased productivity inherently attracts larger labor pools to the urban node.
Historically, the telegraph and the telephone revolutionized this dynamic by allowing internal, instant communication across the city without the need for physical couriers running messages back and forth.
Right, you didn't have to walk across town to make a deal anymore.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the internet has taken that concept of reduced friction and applied it globally. The sources introduced the concept of space-time compression.
Space-time compression, I love that term.
It sounds like sci-fi, but it's very real. The literal physical distance between two economic nodes, say New York and Tokyo, remains constant. The miles haven't changed. However, the time required to interact, transact, or collaborate across that space has been compressed to essentially zero.
And the economic implications of space-time compression are staggering when you consider the physical layout of the city. Historically, a business had to be physically located in the central business district to efficiently interact with financiers, suppliers, and clients.
You had to be in the room.
You had to be in the room. But space-time compression means a modern urban business can operate from the suburban periphery or even a completely different hemisphere while instantly reaching a global customer base.
It alters the fundamental value proposition of central urban real estate. If
Okay.
the node can communicate instantly with the globe, the necessity of physical proximity begins to fracture.
That structural shift is just massive. But cities are not just composed of transit networks and fiber optic cables. They are driven by demographic and economic engines, which brings us to the third primary factor influencing urbanization: population growth and migration.
Because demographic shifts dictate the actual volume of human capital entering these nodal entities.
Right. And the most significant demographic engine historically and presently is rural to urban migration.
The underlying mechanics here are largely driven by agricultural efficiency. As rural populations increase and technological advancements in agriculture reduce the need for manual labor, job opportunities in the rural periphery diminish.
A tractor can do the work of 50 people.
Exactly. This creates a massive push factor, driving populations into urban centers in search of employment, advanced education, and specialized services.
And the sources offer critical context regarding where this is happening globally right now. During the rapid industrialization phases of the 19th and 20th centuries, this massive rural-to-urban migration was most heavily concentrated in industrialized states. The notes specifically cite Great Britain and the USA.
But the current global data shows a complete shift in momentum.
A massive shift.
The contemporary landscape looks drastically different. The notes specify that today, the most massive demographic shifts, the highest volume rural-to-urban migrations are occurring within periphery and semi-periphery countries.
Places that are rapidly developing.
Yes. China and India are highlighted as the primary modern engines of this demographic movement, experiencing truly unprecedented urbanization rates. Furthermore, it's critical to recognize that international migration compounds this growth.
Right, people crossing borders entirely.
Exactly. The influx of global labor pools continually diversifies the cultural makeup and forces the physical expansion of these urban centers.
And populations migrate primarily for economic opportunity, which transitions us nicely to the fourth factor: economic development. The foundational purpose or the functional output of a city evolves drastically over time.
Does this stay static?
No, the notes indicate that ancient cities often function primarily as centers for religious administration or concentrated political power. But the Industrial Revolution fundamentally rewired that function, transforming urban centers into massive hubs for manufacturing and factory labor.
And that functional evolution is entirely visible in the infrastructure itself. The transition from industrialization to modern economic models, which are heavily reliant on the service sector, the technology sector, And advanced finance requires a completely different structural foundation.
You can't run a server farm in a 19th century textile mill without some major upgrades.
Right. A 19th century manufacturing hub required proximity to rail yards, waterways for waste, and massive warehouse footprints. A modern tech and finance hub requires incredibly robust, high-capacity electrical grids, sprawling server farms, and specialized commercial office spaces designed for data flow rather than physical production.
So the next time you observe the skyline of your city, look at the physical structures. The transition from brick manufacturing facilities and industrial smokestacks to high-rise, glass-clad tech hubs and financial centers is not merely an architectural trend.
It's the physical manifestation of this economic evolution. It is the city's changing function permanently altering the physical landscape.
It provides a highly analytical framework for interpreting your surroundings. However, topographical sites, technological breakthroughs, and demographic shifts do not operate in a vacuum.
They absolutely do not.
The trajectory of a city is ultimately guided, restricted, or accelerated by a complex regulatory framework. So what does this all mean?
It means we must examine the fifth and final factor, government policies.
The invisible hand.
Exactly. The invisible forces we have discussed, the expansion of transit, the flow of migration, and the shifting economic sectors are ultimately steered by the legislative and financial decisions of local and national governments.
Governmental intervention dictates both the speed and the spatial direction of urban growth.
And the source material outlines specific mechanisms used to control this, beginning with zoning laws.
Zoning is huge.
It is. By legislating land use, governments physically dictate the layout of the city. When a municipality implements strict zoning that separates residential living areas from commercial business districts and manufacturing zones, they are fundamentally mandating daily travel.
You literally cannot live where you work or shop.
Right. Which inherently forces a wider, less dense physical footprint and necessitates robust transportation infrastructure to bridge those distinct zones.
And beyond the invisible lines of zoning, governments wield massive financial incentives. The decision to allocate federal or municipal funds towards specific infrastructure, say, choosing whether to expand a multi-lane highway system or invest in a subterranean public transit network, determines where development will inevitably follow.
It's the whole "if you build it, they will come" concept.
Precisely. Furthermore, policies regarding corporate tax incentives or residential housing subsidies heavily influence the migration patterns of both massive corporations and individual citizens.
This raises an important question regarding how these tools have historically been applied. When analyzing the specific phenomenon of suburbanization, that outward expansion away from the dense core, the sources impartially detail how government policies acted as a primary catalyst.
Just looking at the mechanics of it.
Right. The notes explicitly state that historical government policies, specifically those providing institutional support for specific types of home loans, combined with massive financial initiatives to expand highway infrastructure, mathematically prioritized suburban development.
The data presented in the notes simply maps the cause and effect here. By leveraging financial incentives to reduce the cost of single-family homeownership in the periphery and simultaneously funding the highway infrastructure required to commute from those homes to the central business district, government policy worked in tandem with the automobile.
It pushed the urban footprint outward, facilitating modern suburban sprawl.
It perfectly synthesizes the various factors we've analyzed today. I mean, a metropolitan area might trace its origins to the topographical advantages of a deep-water harbor.
But its modern iteration, sprawling dozens of miles into the surrounding landscape, is the direct result of evolving transit technology, shifting economic outputs, and the highly specific application of zoning laws and federal highway grants.
Stepping back to view the entire complex system is just remarkable.
It really is a massive puzzle.
To briefly recap the framework outlined in our deep dive today, we trace the origins of urbanization back 10,000 years to agricultural hearths, where the physical topographical advantages of site allowed for early settlement.
We then examine how situation or network centrality along vital trade routes like the Silk Road transformed those settlements into powerful economic hubs.
From those foundations, we explored how the technological leaps of mass transit and the automobile shattered the physical constraints of the walking city, leading to massive outward expansion.
We analyzed the city as a nodal entity, examining how the internet facilitated space-time compression.
We charted the massive demographic shifts of rural to urban migration currently peaking in periphery nations, observed the economic evolution from industrial manufacturing to advanced service sectors.
And finally, we unpacked how government zoning and financial incentives ultimately steer the physical layout of our environment.
It is an intricate, highly reactive system.
It is. And as we conclude this analysis, I want to leave you with a concept that builds upon the technological factors we explored in the source material. We established that transportation technology, specifically the highway and the automobile, created the modern suburb by allowing the workforce to physically distance themselves from the urban core.
Right.
Furthermore, we established that the internet has created space-time compression, allowing businesses and individuals to instantly access global networks from anywhere.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
So, if the tools designed to connect the city ultimately allow us to bypass its physical boundaries entirely, will the highly dense, centralized urban core eventually dissolve?
Wow.
As the necessity for physical proximity to the nodal entity vanishes, will the city simply diffuse into a decentralized network? Or, despite our advanced communications, is there a fundamental biological human necessity for physical, concentrated gathering that technological infrastructure will never fully replace?
That is a fascinating paradox. The very tools built to expand the city might be the ones that render its center obsolete. Or maybe we just fundamentally need each other in close proximity.
Something to think about next time you look at the skyline.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope this comprehensive look at the geographic and economic foundations of urbanization alters how you view your local skyline, your transit networks, and the complex invisible forces shaping your environment. Keep analyzing the structures around you, and we will catch you next time.